The top business stories live from the Sky newsroom. Donald Trump says that the US will be stronger, bigger and better after he announced sweeping tariffs on countries around the world, sparking a global trade war. The Prime Minister says that the UK will respond with cool, calm heads as ministers weigh possible retaliatory measures. And stocks tumble on Wall Street as the president's tariffs send shockwaves through global markets, with tech and retail leading the falls. Very good afternoon. Welcome to Business Live on this Thursday with me, Darren McCaffrey. Well, President Trump today says the operation is over and the patient is healing after he unveiled tariffs on countries across the world, sparking a global trade war and sending stocks tumbling. The Prime Minister described it as the beginning of a new era, and while the UK has stopped short of retaliatory measures for now, ministers are drawing up a list of products for counter-tariffs. Meanwhile, China, the EU and others say they will hit back, and it comes as global stock markets this afternoon have fallen dramatically. We'll have more on the UK's response and get live reaction from the United States in the next 30 minutes. But first, let's bring you up to date with some breaking news. In the last couple of minutes, join our economics editor, Ed Conway, who is at the British Steel plant in Scunthorpe. Ed.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, we are here at British Steel in Scunthorpe. If you've been following the fate of this steelworks for recent months and indeed days, you will know that the owners, which is a Chinese company called Jingye, just said recently that they would begin the process of consultations to shut this place down. And this is the last two blast furnaces in the UK, essentially capable of making steel out of iron ore, so virgin steel, as it's known, an incredibly important part of the industrial cosmos. They began consultations saying that they could potentially close them down as early as June, so a few months' time. But we've been told by union representatives and by workers here that actually the fate of this plant could be decided and will be decided in the next few days. Why is that? It's because all of the raw materials that go into this place need to be ordered. And right now, Jingye haven't put in the orders to get the iron ore and the coke and all of the different ingredients that need to go into the blast furnaces. And if that stays the case, then essentially this place could shut down as early as May. So even earlier than those plans that we reported only last week. It is a real drama here. The fate of potentially 3,000 workers hangs on it, and Britain's ability to create this extraordinarily important substance, virgin steel, depends on the negotiations that are ongoing between British Steel here and the government. And those negotiations look like they've broken down. And so I think the next few days, we're told it really is something now that's measured in days. These decisions that could determine the fate of this plant are measured in days. They are going to be incredibly fateful. So even as Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, has to deal with the drama of what's happened in the Rose Garden last night, he also has to deal with a domestic drama, to some extent influenced by global trade, but nonetheless a domestic drama about the fate of Britain's last remaining blast furnaces. It really is on the edge, Darren.
OK, Ed, live for us there on that. Thank you very much indeed. We're also just hearing in the last couple of minutes Howard Lutnick, of course, who's the US Commerce Secretary, just saying that there is no chance that Donald Trump will back off on these tariffs. Let's speak to Paul Kelso, who is live for us in central London. Paul, no sign there that the United States is going to backtrack on this anytime soon, though clearly there will be space for deals at some stage. And the UK government want to be front and centre of that, don't they, with the Prime Minister trying to reassure people today?
Yeah, they would hope. The British government's entire approach to this has been to try and strike its own, what it's called an economic agreement with the United States, first mooted around the time of that visit to the Oval Office, when it was all smiles and there was optimism that the special relationship might yield some kind of dividend to the UK. Well, all it's got is the knowledge out of the Rose Garden last night that it could have been worse. The UK still has 10% tariffs. The position of the Prime Minister and the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has been to, they're talking about remaining calm. They're certainly not doing anything in a hurry. They're going to try and continue negotiating that economic agreement in the hope that some offer from the UK might result in a give on the tariffs, perhaps a reduction in those tariffs. They have shown a little more mettle today. In the House of Commons, Jonathan Reynolds telling Parliament that he's asked for input from business, wants to know from business what various sectors would like by way of response, how they'll be impacted by the tariffs, both directly and indirectly, and also compiling an indicative list, as it's been described, of potential retaliatory tariffs. They've published a list, thousands and thousands of product lines, the meat and drink of trade negotiations that could be subject to tariffs. It still feels like that is a last resort. I mean, bluntly, the UK does not have much ammunition.
Latest in
Paul,
President
we're just going to
Trump's
stop you there and bring in
series
Mark
of
Carney, the Canadian
US
Prime Minister,
tariffs
who's
that are
talking about
designed
tariffs
to
in
reshape
Canada this
the
afternoon. Let's listen in.
Trading system. The ambition of these measures is enormous. The effects on the global economy will be monumental. We received confirmation that the latest reciprocal tariffs will not be imposed on Canada. At the same time, President Trump confirmed that the tariffs announced last week against our auto industry will come in, and indeed have come into effect today. So while it's progress that further tariffs were not imposed on Canada yesterday, the President's actions will reverberate here in Canada and across the world. Three different sets of U.S. tariffs remain in place and will continue to pose significant threats to Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. And while they have been imposed under different premises, some things are consistent. They are all unjustified, unwarranted, and in our judgment, misguided. And we are already seeing the consequences. Just last evening, workers from Unifor Local 444, with whom I met last week, learned that their auto assembly plant in Windsor will be shutting down for at least the next 2 weeks. That's 3,600 workers who are now out of work, not by their choice. Workers who now worry how they're going to put food on the table and pay their bills. I and my government stand in solidarity with those workers in Windsor and all those workers hurt by President Trump's tariffs. And that's why we committed from the very start that all, and I repeat, all of our tariff proceeds will go to protect workers affected by the tariffs. Les premiers tarifs ont été annoncés.
There you go. That is the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who is talking about the impact of tariffs on Canada in the midst of an election campaign, of course. Let's bring in Ken Fisher, who is Executive Chairman of Fisher Investments. Ken, very good afternoon to you. I'm reading today in the FT, they've described these tariffs as an economic emergency, not just for the people of Canada, but indeed for the people of the United States. Do you agree with that characterization?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Darren. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him think. And what Donald Trump is doing here is just a lot of horsing around with stupid stuff. The fact is, from his election to before yesterday and through now, non-U.S. stocks are doing better than U.S. stocks. Britain's still up net for the year. The fact of the matter is, the market tells you a lot, and he doesn't seem to notice that. But this stuff, which is not good, it's all bad. The real market effect of this is it like people expect, worse than people expect, or better? And there's more ways for it to go better than people think, and more ways for it to go better than for it to go worse.
Okay, Ken, we're just going to listen again back into what Mark Carney is saying in Ottawa.
Canada was not mentioned once in the United States annual report that lists the biggest threat to that country. Just last night, the U.S. Senate made it clear that these tariffs are a mistake. The Senate voted to repeal them in a symbolic but important assertion of both fact and solidarity. The second set of U.S. tariffs were imposed in March on steel and aluminum imports from around the world, including Canada. Canada has long been the United States' main supplier of these materials, materials that are vital to building Americans' homes, their cars, their bridges, their consumer goods, and so much more. These materials are vital to powering America's economy. The President pursued similar tariffs on steel and aluminum during his first term, a process which led to thousands of lost jobs in America. Then, as now, those tariffs were in clear violation of trading agreements. Today it's CUSMA, an agreement that the President himself negotiated and promoted during his first term, an agreement that we in Canada have upheld in good faith. Last week, the President and his administration announced their third set of tariffs, this time against auto imports primarily from Mexico and Canada. In the year I was born, Canada and the United States signed the Auto Pact, an agreement that ended auto tariffs between our nations and began a 60-year period, you can guess my age, a 60-year period of close cooperation, partnership, job growth, and prosperity. And that era has now ended unless the United States and Canada can agree on a new comprehensive approach. Yesterday's actions by the U.S. administration, while not specifically targeting Canada, will rupture the global economy and adversely affect global economic growth. The global economy is fundamentally different today than it was yesterday. The system of global trade anchored on the United States that Canada has relied on since the end of the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped to deliver prosperity for our country for decades, is over. Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. Well, this is a tragedy. It is also the new reality. We must respond with both purpose and force. We are a free, sovereign, and ambitious country. We are masters in our own home. Nous sommes maîtres chez nous. Nous contrôlons notre destin.
There you go. That is Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, talking about the disruption to not just the relationship between the US and Canada, but indeed to the global economy. Let's return to Ken Fisher, the Executive Chairman of Fisher Investments. Ken, thank you for standing by. You were talking earlier about how you're not a big fan of these tariffs, I think it's fair to say. I mean, there is a rationale behind it. You know, Donald Trump would make the argument that what he wants to see is some key manufacturing jobs that have been lost over the decades return to the United States.
Well, yes, and the Tooth Fairy would be gracious to bring things to everyone. But the fact of the matter is, if you accept a lot of what he said yesterday about that topic, it just takes a really long time. If the federal government of the United States had no impediments to these firms starting new plants and capacity in America, it would still take a really long time to unveil that. The damage comes sooner, the benefits come later. But I want to say a lot of this can't really happen in the first place. I mean, the fact of the matter is the agency, the sub-agency of the U.S. government that collects tariffs does not have the capacity to handle all these tariffs. They're about to get swamped because they're not that efficient. They're understaffed. By law, it takes a long time to build a staff that does that function. It's going to be a mess just trying to collect the tariffs.
So, Ken, what do you think is going to happen? Are you then suggesting that either these tariffs won't raise anywhere near the money that Donald Trump suggests they will, or he will strike deals that mean they're just not as advantageous as he would like to initially suggest, or maybe C, that he has to row back on this because of public and political pressure?
All three of those are real possible, and there's going to be some combination of them. But let me say separately and differently, just look at what's been going on from the beginning. I'm a big believer in capital markets. I've been doing this stuff all my life, all my adult life. Everything outside of America, with almost no exceptions, has been doing better than America has since he was elected. And overnight, the fact of the matter is the stock market's telling you something. Overseas from America, in your country, on the continent, in Asia, folks can trade all amongst themselves. That economy is 3 times the size of the US economy. Much of this stuff doesn't have to come into America. Is it negative what he's doing for everyone? Yes, but it's worse for America than it is for non-America in aggregate, which is the bigger and actually more important economy. This is bad, but I don't think it's as bad as people think it's going to be, because I don't think they can collect all the tariffs. The 10% part that's universal will be challenged in court. It is unconstitutional. It'll get to the Supreme Court really fast. He's just doing a lot of horsing around yesterday that will go nowhere, but it will lead to the 3 topic matters you suggested, Darren, including a heavy orientation to try to negotiate some things separate from this.
And what would
country
you,
by country.
What would you then say, Ken, to the chief executive of Nike or Apple, whose shares gone down quite substantially today, but are so heavily invested in China, in Vietnam? I think Nike, for example, has got 130 factories in Vietnam and employs 450,000 people. It cannot just uproot overnight. Would your suggestion to the people in those companies be just stick this out, things will change? Or do you think they maybe do need to seriously look at, because, I think it's 46% tariff on goods coming from Vietnam. I mean, that's not also sustainable for a company like Nike, for example.
All of that is true, but the reality is, the first part is, you mentioned a U.S. company. This is tougher on U.S. companies in the U.S. than it is on, what Trump's doing in some ways, if you think about it, which nobody seems to, when you look at the stock market since he was elected, is he's changed Make America Great Again, MAGA, into Make Europe Great Again, MEGA, because Europe's doing much better. America's going to suffer the pain of all this. But if you're Nike, the only thing you can hope for is that if you make a written, contracted agreement to plow a certain amount of money into America, which will take a long time, they'll suspend those tariffs for you. And there'll be just a ton of negotiations. I have no idea how those will all pan out. Okay. Nike or any other country, any other company.
And just very finally, you're a very well-connected man in Texas, a Republican state, a state that, what large swathes of the Republican Party believe in free enterprise and commerce and in free trade. What's your sense of where they are on all of this? We know, what Donald Trump won an election, and he won an election, to be fair. He's talked about tariffs a lot. He's not doing something that the people who voted for him didn't know was going to happen. But what's your sense of what the mood is like inside the old Republican Party, if you like?
So I think there's a certain amount of disbelief that he's actually doing all this stuff, because people are used to politicians lying a lot. And secondarily, Texas is a conservative state. It's a Republican state, as you said. I'm a Republican by background, tradition, and have been and am. But the fact of the matter is, as my great friend Forrest Gump, once said, stupid is as stupid does, and it's all stupid stuff. And it's going to get real clear to an awful lot of Republicans real fast that this isn't going to work very well.
Okay, Ken, live for us there in Texas. Ken Fisher, we really appreciate your time this afternoon here on Sky News. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, let's bring in Anis Gangbold, who is head of research in global energy markets at Aurora. Very good afternoon to you. And we're looking at the different impacts this is going to have on different sectors of our economy. We've been talking about steel. I've just been talking about the clothing industry. And it will have an impact on energy markets too.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I wanted to focus on the impact on Europe and UK energy markets as it is. Number one, is this going to increase gas prices or energy prices in general? The answer I'd say is no and yes. No, because in the short term, what we've woken up to is a drop in energy prices. And that's because the sentiment is on weaker economic growth. Hence, there'll be also weaker energy demand, weaker energy prices. But in the long term, there could be a shift in the energy market. So the US is a very large exporter of natural gas and oil. Europe is a very large buyer of that natural gas, the UK as well. But if the US decides to invest more in domestic production as a result of tariffs, that could increase US energy demand and therefore leave less energy, oil and gas, for export to Europe. And if the UK does see its imports of US LNG drop, that could raise energy prices for the UK as it scrambles to get supplies from other places. And as wholesale prices rise, retail prices will also rise.
Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it? Is that, you know, if there is retaliatory tariffs or this spreads, then there are more countries looking for those different supplies and demand goes up, which will obviously push up prices.
Exactly. And those of you who are familiar with UK energy might be thinking, oh, is now a good time for the UK to start producing more gas from the North Sea? And the answer, like the short answer is no. So the UK North Sea production has been going on for over 50 years. That means that the fields are aging and they're depleted. So to produce any more from the North Sea would mean an increase in investments. And right now with the uncertainty, it's not likely that people are going to make these long-term investments. We even saw extremely high energy prices in 2022, but that didn't lead to more North Sea investment, because what producers want to see is sustained high energy prices instead of this short-term.
But at the same time, there was some politics at play in that, in the sense that, you know, there were a lot of people campaigning for the very fact that we shouldn't do that because it's not good for our legal commitment to net zero. But it does feel that while that legal commitment hasn't gone away, our appetite, or the political appetite for extracting fossil fuels has changed a little, no?
Yes, we've seen that from governments, but also the private sector, companies rowing back from net zero commitments or weakening them, companies leaving net zero alliances or groups, and governments seeing more focus on security over reducing emissions. And you can also see that reflected in share prices, which have increased and which have come down.
OK. Anis Gangbold there from Aurora. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Ben Wood now to look at the impact this is having on the tech world. He's chief analyst at CCS Insight. Ben, very good to see you this afternoon. And Apple shares are unsurprisingly down. A lot of tech manufacturers, a lot of American tech manufacturers clearly make a lot of their goods elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to look at what's happened to Apple's share price today. $250 billion, the impact this morning when I looked at it, which is just astonishing. And let's face it, in mobile phones, which is such a big volume item, these tariffs really are going to have a massive, massive impact. And we can expect to see prices going up and other things happening to both Apple and Samsung, the biggest players in the market.
Yeah, just on prices, we haven't got retaliatory tariffs yet. Effectively, is this a good time to go? And by the way, the US dollar has fallen a little bit. Is this a good time to go out and buy a phone?
Well, who knows? Because we wake up every morning and find different things that have happened coming out of the White House. But I think, as one of your previous commentators said, this doesn't look like it's going to change immediately. So I guess there will be some stockpiling that goes on. But another interesting thing is going to be consideration of things like second-hand devices. People may say if the cost of a new device is going up, then the best thing for them to do would be to actually go out and buy a second-hand device and not buy a brand new one.
And Ben, what does this mean for the bigger picture here? Does this mean, on the assumption that actually these tariffs do remain in place for a while, that it hampers US tech because ultimately it becomes less desirable, but also may well cost lots of consumers elsewhere in the world more. And there's an opportunity then for China, maybe even for tech companies here in Europe, to try and eat up some of that market share?
I think it's difficult to see that happening because people's love affair with the mobile phone, and particularly the Apple brand and Samsung to a lesser extent, is going to continue. I think they'll just modify the way in which they pay for their devices. They may find they get different propositions from the operators they're working on. So it might be when you sign up for a new mobile phone, you'll pay for it over maybe 4 years instead of 3 years. So I think it's one of those products people can't live without. But of course, it's hugely damaging to the companies that are trying to drive share in the US market. And as I said, Apple and Samsung as the biggest players are going to be the ones who are going to get hit hardest, fastest.
OK, Ben, really appreciate your time this afternoon on the impact this is all going to have on tech. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And just a reminder that it has been a significant day in terms of reaction to those tariffs imposed by Donald Trump. We know the US dollar has been hit. Sterling is up against it today at the highest level I think we've seen for about 6 months. But also the major indices, the Dow Jones, the S&P 500 down in the United States today. In fact, the S&P 500 is on track for its worst day for nearly 3 years. We will have continuing coverage throughout the evening here on Sky News, not least of all coming up with Mark Austin on the News Hour next. As for Business Live, we're back tomorrow morning at 11:30. Do join me then if you can. But as I say, stay tuned for continuing coverage of the impact of these tariffs and the suggestions that it could lead to recession in the United States here on Sky News. And I'll see you tomorrow morning. Goodbye.